Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by Terry Robinson, and we are going to bring you another episode of Tomes of Magic. Today we're discussing Tradition Book Celestial Chorus, and this is for revised edition, so this is actually the second tradition book that was written for the Celestial Chorus in 2001. So today I was wondering how we were going to bring this episode to you in an intelligent and sensitive manner. I was just full of doubt, wasn't sure I could pull it off, but then I had a vision. A voice said to me, "Go forth." And so now I am just all fired up, have a fervor that, frankly, I can see has Terry a little bit worried. But don't worry, Terry. If you feel any doubt during this episode, I will pull you back towards the light. And before we get into it, let's have some announcements. Terry, what's on your mind?
So when you said you saw a vision, I am translating that as the alarm on your phone went off and it said record Tomes of Magic. And
it was rather shrill and repetitive, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And go record was a way of your wife to get rid of you because you were bothering her in the morning. So it really all fits together. Again, the line between magic and the mundane is often quite thin.
Well, this book is 100 pages, and it has 3 authors. Came out in 2001, and it updates the Celestial Chorus tradition for the Council of Nine for the revised edition, post-Avatar Storm, and all the interesting things that were happening in that edition. So I think best way to start this off is with a walkthrough of the book, and I'll bet Terry can help us out there.
The first thing I was excited to see was in the credits section. The interior art is Rebecca Guay, Leif Jones, Vince Locke, and Matthew Mitchell. I very much like Rebecca and Vince's art from the original Celestial Chorus tradition book, and I am very glad that that came back, just kind of as a note. The prelude is entitled A Rude Awakening, and it is setting up Jeremiah, the person that we will follow as the new chorister through the remainder of the book. We get an introduction again to Simon Payne, who is fresh as a daisy off the adventures of Dead Magic. The end of the prologue is a statement that says that this is the 5th English edition to the Book of Ages. The previous Celestial Chorus book was the 4th edition of the Book of Ages. So it kind of sets that up as the framing and then immediately abandons it for the third-person narrative that is used in almost all of the revised tradition books.
It was a little odd for me because it shows the new recruit talking to two, established members of the Celestial Chorus who are going to guide him and teach him, etc. And it presents the two as very, very odd, distant people. It's like their attempts at humor are so very obtuse, and they just seem like very strange people. It's like, as I'm reading this, I'm like, my heart goes out to the new recruit. It's like, what did you get yourself into, pal? These are some odd ducks.
And to me, I liked that, because there is a slight out-of-placeness that the entire book has, which I enjoyed, which someone may view as inconsistent tone and bad writing. But to me, I think it just kind of reinforced the themes that we will eventually get into. In the introduction, this is talking directly to the reader. It presents the chorus as not necessarily needing to be strongly and overtly religious, but finding importance in helping people commune with the One. That is the Celestial Chorus term for whatever entity created and drives reality in some way. That person may or may not still be active, and I hesitate to use the term person or entity just because there's a lot of religious clashes over the beingness of a god. We get a theme of schism and compromises. One of the returning themes they discuss is that throughout its history, the Celestial Chorus, even when it was powerful, was torn apart by doctrinal differences, both internally and externally, and only together will they be able to do anything well. The mood is listed as hope and faith, that they strongly believe that some greater destiny awaits humanity. And then we get a lexicon.
One thing that was odd for me about the introduction was it starts off, the authors are telling everyone what people's preconceptions are on the Celestial Chorus. And I thought, well, that's starting off a book telling the reader what their preconceptions are. It seems like an odd way to start off a book. They had a lot of interesting terms that I didn't see much of in the rest of the book.
Chapter 1, entitled St. John's Words, starts with Jeremiah receiving information about the history of the order, as well as a subtext that Brother Simon Payne has been through some stuff. It does a history section, and this history section moves pretty fast. There is no indication of a prehistory. For instance, the Akashiana book had a section on how the Akashics were the shards of the entities that were entrusted to guard the entrance to heaven. And at some point that shattered and reality as we know it began, and they kind of lost that place. Where in the second edition, or the previous tradition book, they talk at length about the creation of the cosmos. They begin with the one and talk about how one became many, and talked about how there was dissonance and then a period of reintegration, and then dark singers came about and shattered the choir. The earth was created, and the celestial chorus was kind of the first people who were scattered around to deal with all of that. Instead, in this, it starts with the First Age, which they start from prehistory to the 2nd century BCE at a time called the Shattering. This is not necessarily the same thing as the shattering that we have in Changeling continuity, but it does kind of overlap with the Sundering, kind of the everything up until the 2nd century. It tells of Mithras, Gunter, Enoch, Bhishma, and Gilgamesh having been early choristers. I really want to see a Gilgamesh character sheet at some point. I think that would be really cool. Mentions that some of these members may be out there in an umbral realm, and I'm like, oh man, story time. They also mention that a lot of the information for this era is not available because the angels rarely talk about previous ages, and that the early members covered the land giving aid. We get the Second Age, which is the 2nd century BCE to 312 CE at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, more or less when Rome embraces Christianity. Again, just as with the previous history, Mentuhotep gathers everyone at Heliopolis or Ionu that under Akhenaten, that they are all servants of a single entity of some sort. In this case, Mentuhotep was a servant of Amenhotep, who wandered the desert for 40 days and 40 nights and called out, the One replies. These are the first recorded words of the One, which is interesting because we have biblical prophecy that goes back way further, but it is kind of implied that when mortals hear the One and when a mage hears the One, it's kind of a different thing, that there might be a translation layer that has to occur when the infinite touches the finite. The gathering resulted in an agreement that no one can ascend alone. So this kind of sets a line in the sand that in Revised, the idea is that mass ascension is kind of no longer on the table. It's going to be an individual process. But from its founding, the Celestial Course is like, no, this is something we do together. It doesn't mean everyone needs to ascend at the same time, just that it cannot be done alone. The group of people that had been gathered together by Mentuhotep at Heliopolis went back and built adytums, which is just a term for a chantry. The early Nefandi were advocates of ignoring the gods, and they burned down the temples that had been built to Akhenaten. A grand adytum was built in Horizon, which kind of became the central focusing point of the very nascent tradition. Also mentioned that the council was heavily Roman, and that after the, turn of the millennium, it was largely held by the Messianic Voices, which were very early Christians, and the cult of Mithras, or the Mithraists. When Constantine converts, since Rome was the center of power, Constantine converts in 325, or no longer outlaws Christianity in 325, that at that point the majority of the chorus is Christian. And with that begins the Third Age of the Celestial Chorus, which is the Battle of Milvian Bridge to the Convention of Ivory Tower in 1325. They mention that Christianity became popular because it was loud. And the reasoning they give to that was the central figures in the Celestial Chorus were Roman, and the Romans worked very hard on oratory because as people that were elected, that was very important for them to maintain their offices. And this is also the first era when the cabal of pure thought surfaces and fights for the idea that there should be a single church to rule all human activity. With the rise of Charlemagne, there was the belief that he could be the person that would unite Europe and create a shared sacred city. Along this period, this 1,000-year period, the Jews and the Muslims within the Celestial Chorus are marginalized. A schism erupts between the Eastern and Western Christian Church. The Cabal of Pure Thought stokes the fires of the Crusades and are eventually evicted. The Palatine Knights go about killing bad things and eventually becoming what we call paladins, pledged in service to the Holy Roman Empire, or at least Charlemagne at the time. And it also asks, so is the age of prophecy over? And the instructor says, God talks to you if you want him to. And then he mentions that it's far easier to be a monk than a messenger. And I thought that was kind of a beautiful idea, but also a cop-out they needed to make. And with that, we get the Fourth Age. This begins with the Convention of the Ivory Tower in 1325 and continues to now. Early on in this period, the Celestial Chorus is warring with the Hermetics and the Verbena for rule over Western Europe. The Convention of the Ivory Tower snuffs out the dreams of a united sacred city, and then Valoran, who is a chorister of this age, has a vision from the Archangel Gabriel to unite and participate in the Grand Convocation. The date they give for that kind of suggests that the Celestial Chorus only arrived 4 years late, but when have I ever been a stickler for timelines? I'm always a stickler for timelines. The fires of religious fervor in this era were kind of calmed by the Counter-Reformation, which I think is kind of a questionable statement, as well as the papacy closing the Inquisition. But the church proves to lose power for the next century as religious life leaves daily practice, at which point Jeremiah is like, your history just kind of ends there? Are you saying that religion has just been on a slow fade out for 500 years? And the teacher's like, yeah, I am. Which is another point, like just to Adam's earlier point, going like, wow, why is he still here? He's like, he must have lost a bet or something. They talk about the Celestial Chorus in the modern age, that the fundamental problem is that everyone thinks they have a special handle on truth. And how do you deal with that? And the answer is continuous fighting. That they very much want to show people a better way, but they can't really agree on one. We get the Blood-Soaked Days and the Promethean Uprising, which are excerpts from the visions or prophecies of Lucian, and I love these. These are things that you can very much have an NPC in world say, or you can leave them as bits. And if Mage ever did another in-world book in the same fashion as The Fragile Path, I would love just a book of prophecies that every tradition had come up with. I'm putting that out in the world, and I'm hoping someone decides to run with it.
I thought it was interesting to see the different approaches that second edition and revised edition had with Celestial Chorus. As you said, in the first tradition before Celestial Chorus, which came out during Mage second edition, there was a lot of this prehistory. It was like material. It was halfway history, halfway, religious myths about the Celestial Chorus. Before recorded time, we did these things, and the one did these other things, and the angels and the demons, etc. That seemed appropriate for second edition because the earlier editions of Mage had more of a focus on the sort of hidden culture that mages had that sleepers knew just absolutely nothing about. And when we get to revised edition, there's much more of an emphasis on mages are in touch with regular people. They live with regular people. They're a part of the society that all people share. In keeping with that, here in this tradition book for the Celestial Chorus, we have far less of this prehistory kind of information. There's more real-world history because they live in the real world.
I also feel like they wrote themselves into a corner where if they're going to say the overwhelming theme is that choristers don't agree on anything, that if you open it up with this is the prehistory that we all agree on, you're like, oh, well, there goes that. So I'm like, oh man, I missed that. But they couldn't actually have that if they're going to say that nobody agrees on anything. So that was also another one of those, I get why they did it.
Yeah, that also makes sense. There was a number of mentions here of how the Celestial Chorus is very acutely aware of the Nephandi and what they've done in the past, what they're doing in the world. They are very much against the Nephandi. And I noticed that in the tradition books of the first two editions of Mage, there were a number of sections in those where it would say, we hate the Nephandi more than any other group, and we do so much against them. And yeah, it's like Terry and I were thinking, yeah, here's this bit that we see again and again. But with the Celestial Chorus, that really makes sense. I mean, the way that they view things, the way they view themselves, it makes sense that the Celestial Chorus would look at the Nephandi and say, this is the antithesis of everything we're trying to do, and we are very strongly opposed to these people. So seeing those mentions of how they hate the Nephandi, they try to keep tabs on them, that really fit for me. I'm glad that they included that here. Chapter 1 ended on such a downer note for me. It's like the two, established members are talking to the new recruit, and they're saying, "Yeah, we're all divided, and we can't get much done, and there's actually people dying as a result of our divisions and in our grudges that we can't let go of. But hey, you might change all that." It's like going to visit the United Nations, and they're saying, "Yeah, things are in a mess. World War III is right around the corner, but you, son, you might change all that." And you're like, "Yeah, right, and I might not."
When people are like, revised is just a bummer, I'm like, no, it's all about adventure and changing the world. And then you read the thing that's like, yep, things have continuously gotten worse for literally half a millennium. You're like, maybe I understand why some people weren't as big on revised as I was. Chapter 2 is entitled Holy Tasks, Sacred Paths. And it opens with an excerpt about someone by the name of Nona. And Nona is a prison inmate at a women's prison in Texas that does not have a good end to their life, and then there is a war that kind of erupts over this person's soul, or something like that, over this person's specter or wraith, whatever term you would like to use about it, essence or what have you. And we are introduced to a chantry that operates out of this prison and tries to reduce the suffering of the inmates, and that doesn't always go well. Much of this chapter and the ones after it are I guess you could say, a very personal meditation on what the choristers feel their day-to-day job is. For instance, we get the idea in a lot of other tradition books that what the characters do and what the average member of the tradition do aren't necessarily the same thing. For instance, when we talked about the Akashiana, there were a bunch that just kind of led monastic lives or just tracked avatars through the cycle, and your characters probably aren't going to do that. And again, this was one of those where Jeremiah meets the Rabbi Deborah Levin, who is one of the last masters on the earth, and it is I think, very intimate portrayal of what the life of a chorister could be. She talks to Jeremiah that the idea of monotheism means rejecting the 5 idols. And she outlines these 5 idols as wealth, power, vanity, gluttony, and size, and then goes on to talk about how other external groups in the Ascension War have given in to one of them. For instance, she says the technocracy is a servant of size. Then get very long asides introducing the guardian orders, the theological orders, and the various other religions that are within the Celestial Chorus, as well as some other factions. But before we get to those, there are a series of asides. The first one is talking about what prayer really is and kind of breaks it down into some common types. One is the petition, where you ask the one to do something. The other is the command, where you say that you have been given some sort of power and you are claiming your right to access it to influence the world. I appreciated that. I think there may be other types of prayer in there, and I would have liked some more templating. But they also mention that the power of prayer is great because it's generally recognized by other paradigms, in the same way that when we were talking about blood treachery, everyone recognizes the zodiac, that almost everyone will have a notion of prayer, and that allows some choristers to be more likely to work effects with other mages. And I liked that as an idea. I thought that was kind of neat. The focus section I thought was pretty well done. There's a lot of ones that you would understand, like fasting and prayer and reflection and isolation and so on. But it also talks about other foci that the Celestial Chorus is likely to use. For instance, possession, allowing a being to inhabit you to gain power, that unlike maybe it being one of the Loa, it may be a saint or an angel or something like that. They talk about how sacrifice literally means to make holy, that the sakra at the beginning of that word is the origin of sacred, or more accurately, to share it. And the idea is that you are sacrificing to show that you can do without, to either indicate your power in the world or to request power from something else. The final focus that they had that I really liked was the idea of discussion, that you can do a great magic through theological debate. And this isn't strictly mind effects, that discussion allows for the establishment of unity of purpose. It gets everyone on the same page and allows you to act. In fact, in the later sections of the book, it talks about how dissonant is a flaw a character can have, where you just don't work well with other people, not because like you're a badass James Dean rebel without a cause person, but just like you got like 2 left feet when it comes to doing magic with other people. We get a walkthrough of the spheres, and I didn't think any of these were particularly interesting. They make a mention that there is some sort of angelic script that is used that they believe that Enochian is derived from. I would have liked literally any more information about that. Like if we have another secret angel language, I would really like that. And they mentioned that because many choristers believe that all things emanate from the one, you can have scientific and technological foci. They use the term technosi. I'm not sure how I feel about that, because ultimately most of the celestial chorus is not in any way Gnostic, but they're using gnosi in the wisdom sense, in the idea that you can derive wisdom from technology. The rotes that we give are fine. The one that leapt out at me was Penance for the Sakari, which allows you to redirect paradox from one person to another, and it introduces the idea of the red and the white monks. At first I'm like, oh man, are we getting more on the Arcanum? And I just think it's another group that happened to be called the Red and the White Monks. But if we get a future 5th edition book where the two overlap, I would certainly love to see that hot mess. We get a bunch of Tools of the Just, which are magic items and so on. It mentions that holy water is very common, but it is not meant to replace faith. It is meant to supplement it. And you're like, wow, you're making it sound like holy water is something where we go to like the holy water store and kind of stock up on it. And if you abuse it too much, you can get addicted to holy water and it'll stop working until you like come correct with God or something like that. And I just thought that was kind of weird. They make mention of Justice Blades because Revised reintroduces the fact that everyone thinks swords are cool. And they also introduce penance beads, which are items that seem to be able to capture the avatar of a dead mage to keep around as a reminder to do something. They don't really have systems for it, and I kind of wish they did. I'm not really sure what to... The last kind of really neat thing in the chapter is they have a discussion of true faith and what it is. And Revised, again, takes the approach of giving the storyteller a bunch of options in general. And here it gives a bunch. Some of them are that one person can have both, or one person can't, or true faith is just awakened magic, and you should reskin true faith that others have as being sphere magic that they just don't realize that they're using. Another is that there is no true faith. And finally, that the choristers aren't mages. And it's like, yep, this is a kooky one, but we're not going to stop you from it. And I'm like, thanks, Jess Heinig. It says that the important parts of it are that you need to have a rating in true faith, a code of some sort that your character follows, and then a way of replenishing faith through acts. And then it gives a list of potential powers that true faith could have. And the big thing for players and storytellers, I think, in this chapter are going to be the various orders of the Celestial Chorus. And when I think orders, I think subgroups, and I think Adam Simpson. Adam, could you tell us about the orders?
Well, it's a good thing I'm here today.
Convenient.
But seriously, there are 24 internal factions within the Celestial Chorus, and I am going to give you a detailed account of every single one. Actually, I'm just kidding. Yeah. That would take a lot of time and probably would not be terribly interesting. Plus, there is an episode on the first Celestial Chorus Tradition book, which was put out for the second edition of Mage, where we talk about a lot of these books. If you would like more information from us, you can certainly go back to that episode and get it. And if you'd like it straight from the book, these are available PDF online and... certainly worth it. But it was interesting for me that there were some new ones added to this book, and those are certainly worth talking about. One was called the Silver Moon Clan. The name sounds like a musician group to me, and that's because it is. A loose group of singers and other musicians who formed in 1968. There were previous versions in the past, but they didn't hold together very well. They believe in their mission to wander the earth, ministering to those in need with their music. Many have a chantry as a designated home base, even though they aren't often there. Many members have insights into the entropy sphere. From there, we get into the Guardian Orders. Guardian Orders are basically the factions within the Celestial Chorus that believe in picking up weapons and protecting people who need protecting, or taking the fight to the enemies who desperately deserve it. So we'll start off with the Brothers of St. Christopher. This is a new group for this book. They were started in November 1996 by a psychic whose vision called him to protect the innocent at all costs. They often work to support gay rights, visit justice upon perpetrators of hate crimes, and undermine racist groups. Less than half the members are awakened mages, but those who are focus on the mind sphere. The founder has not been seen for over a year. Rumors are circulating. We also have a new group, the Order of St. Michael. This was founded in the 1950s in Central America, and this group has grown quickly following the Avatar storm thanks to their focus on local action and their vigilante approach. They target primarily large corporations, organized crime, and corrupt politicians. They don't like to accept apprentices, preferring established choristers instead. Awakened members favor the sphere of forces. A new group within the Guardian Orders is I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Kevra Kedisha. This is a Jewish group formed in the Middle Ages to help wraiths resolve problems and move on. They are not easily fooled by dishonest wraiths, recruited non-awakened members long before other chorister factions did. More than half their current members can't use sphere magic, but those who can focus on the spirit sphere. As for the other Guardian Orders, we have the Knights of St. George and the Dragon. This was a traditional militant group that modeled themselves after knights in the Western tradition. They took the fight to the villains of the world. They focused on hunting down vampires that were harming sleepers, and they also were very serious about pursuing Nefandi that they knew about in the world. Now, there is an update on this group for Revised Edition. There was a terrible catastrophe in 1991, a dramatic conflict where a ancient vampire resurfaced and was causing trouble, and the knights joined the fight, and a large number of them were killed, and so this group now has far less influence and far less members than it did before, and it is wondering exactly how it is going to move forward. Today, less than 30 members remain, and of those 30, not all of them are sphere magic using mages. There's also the Sisters of Gabrielle. This was a woman-only group that modeled themselves more on classical Greek themes. They were also a militant order that would pursue enemies who were harming sleepers and causing trouble for the Celestial Chorus. After the Avatar storm, they also have had their numbers decimated and are a much smaller group than they used to be. We also have the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, better known to most Mage fans as the Templars. This is the craft covered in Book of Crafts in 2nd edition of Mage. And in Revised Edition, they were having such a difficult time that they joined the Celestial Chorus. And what I found satisfying reading this section is that they do make it clear that the Templars have fractured into two different groups. There is the group that has thrown in its lot with the Celestial Chorus. They are working towards cooperating with other chorister members, becoming a little less straight-laced and formal than they were in the past. They're accepting female members. And the other group of the Templars is the more severe, male-only, formal, traditional group that is not serious about joining the Celestial Chorus. They are remaining outside. The two splintered factions of the Templars do communicate with each other, but each one is not quite sure of the other and their mission for moving forward. Next, we come to the theological orders. We have the monists. They emphasize the idea that all religions and all philosophies are basically pulling in the same direction, and it's better to have unity and to not emphasize differences. The septarians are the old guard. They are the highly traditional and strict groups. They hold very seriously to their different real-world religions and want to convince others of the truth of their creeds. We have the latitudinarians. Let's see, here you say that 3 times fast. A lot of members of non-Western religions, and they want to see things change. They want to reform and move into the modern era and not emphasize so much the creeds that divided people in the past. We have the Alexandrian Society, and they are, I guess you could say, the more modern-leaning group within the Celestial Chorus. They emphasize that science and faith should not be at odds with each other. They have a lot in common. The Celestial Choristers who use more techno-magic and technological foci would be in this group. We have the Anchorites, the group that is not a group, it is a description of loners who keep to themselves. And basically these are hermits and individualists who separate themselves off from the rest of the Celestial Chorus and often society at large and try to pursue insights on their own. We have the Children of Albi. This is a group that is linked to the Albigensian Crusade of European history. and they are connected with Gnosticism. We have the Nashamites. These are cousins to the children of Albi. They believe that the spirit world is the true battlefield and try to withdraw more from things happening in the physical world. We have 8 real-world religion groups. We have the Gnostics, we have the Hare Krishnas, we have the Hindus, we have the Jains, we have the Mithraites. They follow the god Mithras. We have the Rastafarians, which is a new group. They were not discussed in the previous Celestial Course tradition book. We have the Sikhs, we have the Sufis. We have some nice write-ups on these groups, but basically it just talks about how they are serious about their faiths. There's not a lot of secret information about underground headquarters or great plans for the future. And next we have the other factions, and here we have 2 new groups, new to this book, I mean. We have the Bat Bina. This is a woman-only group that studies the Kabbalah. Some believe they have a connection to an ancient group called the Lions of Zion. And we have the Song of the Ancients. Started in the early 1980s, this loosely organized group gathers those who belong to or closely study tribal and ancient religions. They gather once a year and maintain close ties with the Dream Speakers and the Verbena. And that about sums up the 24 factions of the Celestial Chorus. Now, I'm going to take a moment to share some of my thoughts on Chapter 2 of this book. I really enjoyed the sidebar they had on prayer and cooperative magic. It just really clicked for me. When some mage who's not a Celestial Chorister is going to be working some magic, and a Chorister is there and wants to do cooperative magic, it just kind of makes sense that they would basically stand behind them, pray fervently for them, and then the first mage would get some bonuses or some additional successes to what they're doing. I can really see that scene in my head. The sidebar on hanging foci I thought was a very good point to bring up. And this is basically the idea that a chorister is going to employ a focus that takes a long time, like an all-night prayer vigil or fasting for 5 days, etc. And because of that, they're going to get a greater ability to use their magic later on, after they're done with that. Basically, you show up to the fight and say, yeah, well, I've been fasting for the past 5 days, so now I can use this magic more easily. And I think it's good for storytellers to think about this, because you don't want to get into this problem where the player shows up and says, well, I did all my foci yesterday, so now I can just like pull off my effects, like snapping my fingers, like 1, 2, 3, bam. Hey, isn't that cool? I'm mopping the floor with the bad guys. That's not the ideal. But one thing I really did like is conjunctional effects, where you're using more than one sphere to do something. And I thought that these hanging foci would work very well with conjunctional effects, so that if you want to do something that is prime and forces together, then the prime part of that is the fasting you already did. That's the hanging focus. Then forces, the focus for that, you have to actually use during the scene. And so I think that's a way to make use of this without getting really unbalancing effects. But I like that they brought this up. It is a nice discussion for a storyteller to have with players. Of the idols that the mentor of the chorus was talking to Jeremiah about, one of them is utility, with a capital U, and that was the idea that following schedules and playing by the rules and doing things the way that everybody else does them these days is terribly important, and is something that kind of people follow out of a feeling of necessity. And that was it was interesting. It was sort of a deeper kind of philosophical idea without being tied too strictly to any specific religion. So I really liked that idea. But at the same time, it really seemed to click better with the strong ideas in first edition Mage of how the technocracy is taking a very, very modern, very Western mindset and trying to force the entire universe into that mold. It's like, yeah, I like this idea of utility with a capital U, but yet at the same time, it just seems to fit in the earlier editions a little better than this one. But that's an idea that our listeners can chew on their own. Perhaps they'll have an insight into that I did not have. I really like to get my information about what's going on with a tradition of the Council of Nine outside of a fiction narrative, because for me, role-playing books are used more often as a reference book that you want to pull off the shelf quickly when you're prepping for a game. I think that when you have a long, artfully written fiction narrative, it works really great for the initial reading of a book, but not as well for referring to it later. And so this whole chapter 2 is this, well-written fiction narrative, but when I'm grabbing off the book off the shelf in 5 months, it's going to be harder to pick through that to find ideas of things. And one example of that is the Celestial Chorus's views on other traditions in the Council of Nine, other factions of mages. It is in here, but it's woven in so artfully that if you want to find it quickly in the future, you're basically going to spend a lot of time just rereading the whole darn chapter and picking it out as you go. Some of the rotes in the end, I usually don't spend a lot of time on rotes. I'm not a person who can clue in really well on details of game mechanics, but there's a rote called Abundance, and that is basically a recreation of the well-known New Testament myth where Jesus takes a little bit of fish, a little bit of bread, he starts sharing it with people, and there's really a lot of food, and a whole lot of people have a great lunch. It makes this a matter effect. And my thinking as a mage storyteller, regardless of the edition of mage that I'm working with, is I think that food is not regular matter. It has a kind of life-giving nutrition in it. And because of that, I approach food as a conjunctional life matter sort of effect. But that's just me. Storytellers can take their own view on that. Also, there is a rote Penance for the Sicarii, which Terry mentioned, and that mentions again the red and white monks, which are in this book a sort of hidden group in the background that may or may not really be a part of the Celestial Chorus's past. And of course, the only other mention we've seen in World of Darkness books of the red and white monks, capitalized, is the book on the Arcanum, where they are apparently these two secret societies that are battling for control of the Arcanum. Behind the scenes. And so, of course, reading this book, it's like, are these the same red and white monks? Don't know. Could be. They really could be. But it was just fun to see them again and to wonder about that. And finally, the true faith discussion at the back of the book. I thought that was really great. And it's needed for Revised Edition because true faith becomes a 7-point merit in the Revised Edition core book. And reading through that merit, as I did yesterday, it's very sketchy. It's very vague about what you can actually do when you have this merit. I mean, it gives you some hints, but not very specific. And so in this section of the tradition book, they have a page saying, here's what the powers could be, and here's how they could actually work in game mechanics. And they make sense. I would probably want to use them in that way. And as for the discussion of true faith, do you let mages have it? Do you prevent them? How do you work it into your game? As a storyteller of World of Darkness games, the way that I have always dealt with true faith is it is a mortal tier power. It is a set of abilities that I only allow regular humans to have. I don't let were creatures or vampires or mages, changelings, etc. have any access to these. It's just for the regular Joes who are trying to stay alive. And I like the true faith rules that was given in The Inquisition. I think that was 1995. It was a Year of the Hunter book. I think it was kind of billed as a supplement to Vampire the Masquerade, but it has true faith as a ability that starts at 1 dot. It can go as high as 10 dots, and the rules for how you use your dots of true faith made sense for me. I think that it's fine to have mages who are very serious and devout with their religions and gain inspiration from that, but when I'm actually running mage for people, I think it makes sense to simply state any abilities that might be true faith for a regular person would automatically be translated by a mage's avatar and manifest as sphere magic. It makes sense for me, it keeps things clean, and it keeps me out of a lot of potential problems when I'm running World of Darkness games for people.
Yeah, I've always been curious about the true faith thing, because in a lot of times the book seems to present mages with access to either sorcery or true faith as like broken. And I'm like, it's a 7-point merit. Like, That's 2 dots of arete, basically, at character creation. I could see that it would get messy, and I think it does ask a really interesting metaphysical question of, like, what does the Avatar think about this, John? I think that could be neat, but yeah, the other games have done it in more detail, and it also mentions that suddenly now it's a track where you spend points of it rather than it just being a static value. And it's like, okay, so now I have this other stat that I need to keep track of that may or may not be on the character sheet that I've chosen to print. So at least, I guess you could say, logistically, having true faith in there can get messy.
Yeah, certainly.
Chapter 3 is entitled Scattered Souls, and this is the people chapter, and it opens with some notable choristers. We talk about how there were a lot of internal squabbles, but the Reckoning seems to have done one of 2 things. In some cases, it has united people in the sense that it's like, hey, well, we've lost a lot of the academic people who were bickering, and obviously the world needs us now more than ever. This should help us work together. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who kind of like the brother that was talking with Jeremiah in chapter 1, where this is further proof that we are straying further from the light of the one. We get 3 noted singers. The first is Simon Payne, who was originally a mage that was recruited to the technocracy that reawakened during a chorister versus Nefandi fight, during which none of their other magic would work, but they grabbed a Bible and a miracle happened. And I think the cool part here was that they list that the rest of his operation unit listed him as dead, because they knew that if word of this miracle that Simon had performed got back to the technocracy, they would just kind of flat out murderate him. And I liked the idea of a technocratic group that had seen such weird stuff and had worked together so much that they're like, no, just go. We will say that you were killed and we couldn't find your body, which is a weird amount of pathos to have for the technocracy. The second one we get is Aiko Kawaguchi, who is a 90-year-old monist peace activist who thinks the chorus needs to get in line soon or they're going to miss any opportunity to change the world. And I think this is a very good example of a doctrinaire character that you could have presented into it. And then we get Jude Bankole Kuti, who is a purist Christian, who is a rigorous thinker, who believes that everyone needs to unite under the banner of Christianity in some way, is active in sub-Saharan Africa. And I thought was an interesting case of, like, yes, some people are doctrinaire religious people and they have their reasons and they do belong in Mage. You don't need to play one, but they exist. And I think these chapters are at their best when they do show that full breadth of things. Sometimes the stereotype is informed by real-world experience, and while that doesn't need to be the majority of the activity, it is useful sometimes to bring that up. The next section is talking about All Chorus Chronicles, and the All Blank Chronicles are kind of dull to me, but this one I thought was kind of interesting. One of the things it focuses on is that it is hard to play a doctrinaire character that gets along with other people who are also doctrinaire characters. Partially because they kind of point out that religion is something that most people have a strong feeling about. It could be for, it could be against, it could be a particular faith, where if you bring up the question of, so what do you think about witchcraft? Like, you're not going to get as strong a response. Or what do you think about Hermeticism? You're not going to get as strong a response. But religion and those kind of personal beliefs are something where most people are going to have something they bring to the table. They say that one of the unifying forces is to care for sleepers a lot, and that provides instant motivation. That for an all-chorus game, you can always have some peril to the mortal world that should act as a unifying force. It also kind of stares into the face of the core concept of Mage regarding characters being doctrinaire of how can all of these things be true? And more than a lot of other groups, with maybe the exception of the technocracy, the Celestial Chorus is constantly having that fight within itself. Not even thinking, when you look at the Order of Hermes, obviously they think that they're right and other people are just practicing lesser forms of magic. But even within the chorus, they don't necessarily agree on what right is. They recommend chronicles that battle the infernal, or that talk about the messiness of what happens when you try and mix morals, politics, and theological questions. And it has a little aside called The Big Issues, talking about how, yes, some choristers are flat out racist or sexist. that they have difficulty dealing with social inequality as something that when you have a group that is pulling across a wide swath of the socioeconomic spectrum, that there are internal battles over resource allocations and so on. And this was a useful and necessary aside, and I wish you well, storyteller, in figuring out how you want to put it into your chronicle, because I have remarkably little advice to offer. There is another aside on the types of evil that can exist, the idea of cinematic versus real evil, and that it is important that you present the downsides of real evil, that evil causes hurt, and that should be shown. One of the failures to me, though, of this section is it talks about how moral relativism can only go so far, to which I disagree. I have run into moral relativists that really don't have a limit to how far they could go, ergo the word relativism in moral relativism. And having a group that feels that it can categorically occupy the moral high ground, I think, is one of the powers and one of the problems of having a chorister game. Everyone thinks they are right, and in a relativistic framework, it is very hard to come up with a justification for saying that somebody else in some way is wrong. The next section we get is our sample chorus, and this was interesting in that it was realistic, but to me useless. They present the idea of the organization Interfaith Outreach that operates out of Vancouver, and that they were previously from a group that was on the front line of the Ascension Wars called the Nine Fires, that there was a technocratic backlash after the Summer of Love, and that this group thought that North America was ill-defended against the technocracy, so they banded together to fight them, and the Nefandi seemed to have free reign. They had very high mortality rate, and they ultimately wound up tipping their hand and getting the notice of Her Phlox, which was a character that was mentioned in the original Book of Madness, that they have regrouped in Vancouver and never left. So they took this dynamic, in-your-face, out there, fighty group, crushed it, and replaced it with a group that has prayer luncheons. I get why that was done. It just was one of those things where it kind of sucked all the air out of using this group. If you want your group to run into a bunch of people that have a lot of war scars and don't necessarily agree on what they do, but they're trying to do their best, this is a fine group for doing that. They promote anti-racism and ecumenism, and those are certainly fine goals. And they can serve as a cautionary tale to a group that wants to really take the fight to the enemy, as it were. But I would have difficulty using it. It seems like their most interesting days are kind of behind them, or I would at least need more information on the programs that they're doing at current and how that can be more of a story hook for me. It was a little too mundane for my tastes. The section ends with two more pieces. One are Legends of the Chorus, which is something we got in the Akashiana book, which I liked. And here it talks about the Merovingians, which were a group in the previous Celestial Chorus group that we didn't get new information on, that it was a hereditary line of kings who built fortresses on ley lines, and that they could still be out there doing stuff. They talk about the kingdom of Prester John, which was a medieval legend about this massive kingdom where even all of the animals were Christian, that it may, in this case, be an umbral realm, and that everyone was devout. And the final one was the Celestial Temple of the Sun. This was something that was originally introduced in first edition as physically lying below the Vatican. In second edition, it was referred to as a myth or a legend that no one had ever been able to verify. And here it is presented as, with the Great Adytum having been cut off during the Avatar Storm, their main umbral realm, that the idea that there is a physical location that all choristers could look to for guidance and just to collect themselves would allow them to become remarkably potent again. And that suddenly having access to these red or white monks would instantly increase the power of the Celestial Chorus beyond what they can do for now. Then we get 8 character templates. These are fine. I thought they were perfectly interesting. It does move around a lot in the space. It gives you some very traditional characters, whether it be a Knight Templar or a relic hunter or somebody who is acting in a obviously priestly capacity, but it also gives you a few other character templates. One is the Angel Incarnate, which is a character who believes that they are, as the name says, that God has a mission for you, that you are one of the ones chosen, and that your goal is to act righteous. And then, so what did you think about this chapter?
I agree that the sample cabal was not so very interesting. I mean, it focused very much on personalities in social conflict rather than physical conflict, and I think a lot of the writers for Revised Edition really liked that. It's not something I get quite as excited about. The previous leader was taking the fight to the technocracy. There was a lot of actual physical combat and people were dying. And she went into quiet and she was no longer able to lead. So a younger man came up, sick, and he was much more peaceful. He didn't want conflict. He took them over to Vancouver and said, let's lie low for a while and get involved in more positive things to help with the sleepers. And so now this woman who used to be in charge, she's come out of quiet and she's just about ready to take leadership back. And she wants to go back to the old days of violence and machine guns and fighting the technocracy, and that's supposed to be a really terrible thing. And you can tell that she's no good and she's going to bring a lot of problems because she's in her 50s. And as we know from Revised Edition, old people are just bad. So I thought that was a little bit too true to form for Revised Edition, but they weren't terribly exciting for me. I would not want to use them in my own games, but I can see how the Revised Edition writers really liked the interpersonal social conflict that can come with this group. I thought the legends were pretty cool. Merovingians, the kingdom of Prester John that might be in the Umbra, might just be a legend. If there is a Prester John, he might be a hero, he might be a real villain. And then also the Celestial Temple of the Sun. And for the first time, the red and white monks are connected to the Celestial Temple of the Sun. Like if you were to actually find the place, you would find these guys hiding out and like catch them in the middle of lunch, and they'd drop their teacups and say, who are you guys? So I guess that's one way that if you really want to work with the red and white monks in your games, you could have some information about Celestial Temple of the Sun and bring them in that way. I thought that was interesting. Of course, a few things that occurred to me. I wanted to hear a little more detail about how the Celestial Chorus has adjusted to a post-Avatar Storm world. There was some information in here, but I just wanted to get more. I mean, I thought it was appropriate to hear more about how different internal factions had totally changed direction because of leadership change, or how they lost a lot of headquarters in Eastern Europe or Central America, or some part of the globe, and so they've increased their influence in one part of the world and lost it in another, or just more information about how they're different after this cataclysmic event that happened in the world of Mage. Again, there was some information. I just was hoping to find a little more to hang on to for being a storyteller. Also, this portrayal of the chorus does take a noticeably different approach from what we see in the first tradition book, which was the second edition of Mage. This group is a lot more problematic, a lot more schismatic. There's a lot more arguments, a lot more conflicts. They're less productive. It's a lot less hopeful. I mean, a few places in the book they try to hit this note of your players could be the ones who turn this around. It's like, okay, great, we could tell stories about that, sure. But I mean, just looking at the tradition as it is presented here, this is a much less productive, much less positive take on them. And so it is quite different from the first tradition book in that sense. What do you think, Terry?
I agree. It's one of those things where all the choristers are trying in their own way to improve the world, but they don't agree on how to, and they kind of fight with each other. It does make mention, though, that there seems to be a network of cabals and chantries that are working together, and whether or not that is new, we don't know. Maybe with the loss of the Grand Adytum and their centralized power, some of that argument has gone away, but we just didn't get kind of enough information. Like, the two editions are so different that I don't know if it's a before and after, or if it's just a simple different take and they were always like this, and they're kind of replacing what was done before. It is kind of interesting because in a lot of cases, it is indicated that the Celestial Chorus is hierarchical, but we really never get any information that they're hierarchical. We get the idea that there is a leader of some sort, but we don't get the idea that there is a leader, that there's a sub-council, that the chantries report to the sub-council, and that the cabals within it report up through the chantry. So there is a leadership structure, as literally every tradition has in some way, shape, or form. They at least all have a primus, but we don't really get any information on what those lines of communication looked like. I also understand from an RPG design point of view, you want there to be more problems in the world than you think is strictly necessary. That way the characters get to choose how they interface with the world. The problem is if you present too many problems and they're too large, that creates hopelessness. So the goal is to create a spread of problems at varying levels of difficulty, so that way the characters could say, this is the game world I see, this is the thing I think my character would like to change, and this is a game I think we can have that would allow us to influence that. But when it's something like the tradition is in tatters, that's above what a starting level Cabal is going to be able to be. And the idea of working up to that, I think, is a hard one. So from a game design point of view, I understand why there would be these kind of tensions, but I don't think it was quite dialed in.
Yeah, good point.
It's interesting because there's a lot less new material that we got compared to the Akashic Brotherhood book. The Akashic Brotherhood was basically like, wait, they were previous editions of Mage? Like it it was so different to the point where I wouldn't even talk about the previous Akashic Brotherhood book to a person who was interested in the Akashiana. For the Celestial Chorus, I can't say the same. If someone's like, hey, I already have Swords of Faith, can I just use that? I would have to say yes. The only changes I would make is if you want to do True Faith, we can do that. If you want to take, there's some more groups that maybe you might find interesting. But on the whole, there's a lot less new material. This book very much felt about mood in a way that a lot of the other books don't. I got a strong sense of what was happening in the fiction with the interaction between Deborah and Jeremiah and Simon and Rathbane in a way that I don't in a lot of them. I'm not sure what caused that. If nothing else, the book was well written, even if it didn't have the material that we wanted to. Sometimes books come across as being over the top or being too action oriented. So the tone, I think, came through, but it was a little too somber. This felt like something where it would be harder for me to recommend the Celestial Chorus to a character, but it would give me a lot of fodder to have NPCs. The Cabal that they present in here is kind of uninteresting. They have full statted out character sheets, which I certainly find useful, and I will take NPCs for days. But this is a book that I would have a little more difficulty handing to a player without giving them a preface to be like, oh no, our chronicle is going to be super somber, or our chronicle isn't. Even through Revised, there was a sense of energy and possibility and wonder. Bitter Road talks about that a lot, where yes, all the masters are gone in that clear space. I don't get enough information here on that exciting and dynamic part. They talk about hope, but I don't really think they gave us a lot of it in terms of how the chorus operates. It does a good job, though, of transmitting what the day-to-day life of a non-PC chorister is, and that is something I am often fascinated with, because that is something I need to explain NPCs, where it's one of those things where it's like, yes, I get the idea of what an Akashiana member does or what a Euthanatoi character does, but I don't necessarily have a good idea of what the rest of the tradition is doing. This did give me a pretty good idea of what most choristers are probably up to, or at least, or a strong portion of them. The one promise that the book made, or the one thing that the book made in the beginning, was the idea that the chorus is about shepherding people through their relationship with religion and divinity, that everyone has a different relationship. And they even make mention early on that not all choristers are religious, in the same way that you can often be guided through a process by someone who has never been through that. Like my doctor can give me advice about a medical condition they never had and speak with confidence and authority on it. I was really hoping that there would be like more or less an atheist celestial chorus group, where it is people who believe that it is important to have common cause and ceremony and purpose, but not even necessarily believe it, but still think that the community that engenders is powerful and an emanation of what they call the One, even though they view it as strictly allegorical. I was really hoping that would be there, and I really think that would have given a completely new take on what can be within the Celestial Chorus. We don't get that. I could come up with something, but it's always nice to have it in the book, so that way when someone's like, how can you have non-religious choristers? You're going to be like, well, it's in the Revised book, page 62. That is something I thought we would get more information on, as that role of shepherd and how there can be a disconnect between the person leading the group and the beliefs of the group. Often in faith traditions, there is a difference in orthodoxy between the priestly group and the observant group, or between the academic group and the lay practitioner. And I would have liked a little more information on that. That might be a little too esoteric, but overall, this is a well-written book that I don't think you strictly need to have if you already have the 2e book. What's your buy decision on this one, Adam?
Yeah, about the same. I mean, there's some nice material in here, but if someone had the first book and said, do I need the second book? I'd say, well, not actually. I mean, here's Here's 3 or 4 little internal factions which might be interesting and really might not be what you need for your game. So yeah, it's hard to put a strong buy recommendation on this book, even though there is some good material here. Yeah, definitely. Well, I've got a few adventure ideas. Then I think we're ready to hear a quote and round out our episode.
Cool. What are your adventure ideas?
Well, after considering this book and trying to write something that plays to the strengths of this book, I've got first, number 1. A year ago, many choristers were commenting on the good news that 3 different members of the Arcanum awakened through spiritual visions and found the chorus. Now, one of those fledgling mages died within the same week that the other 2 disappeared. This has caused an uproar, and chorister factions are accusing each other. A newly appointed council rep begs the players to investigate. They find all 3 apprentices were researching legends of the celestial temple of the sun beneath Rome, and one had detailed info on sewer entrances in that city. Then a hermetic contact tells the players all Arcanum members have evacuated Rome, and the hermetic there who observed the Arcanum is missing. Are the red and white monks of Chorus and Arcanum legends more than allegories? What waits for them beneath Vatican City? Number 2, Bartholomew Papadakis, founder of the Brothers of St. Christopher, has been missing for a year amid swirling rumors. Preeti, a young woman currently leading the brothers, is asking for help. It seems the charismatic leader has learned how to ferry people safely to the penumbra. He's starting a crusade to fight Bane spirits in the city's penumbra, and many members of the brothers are following him. Already brothers are dying, while Preeti's work to fight injustice in the human world is falling apart. As the players try to help the volatile situation, conservative members of the chorus start a campaign to cut off the Brothers of St. Christopher. Can the players handle a conflict on 2 fronts? Leadership and negotiation skills will be sorely tested, while those with knowledge of the spirit sphere won't get any rest. Number 3, the Cathedral of Chartres, France, is having a horrible time. An embezzlement case is making national news, while a predator is assaulting teens in the neighborhood, leaving evidence that points to the cathedral. Players are asked to help and find a demoralized cabal of choristers beset by technocracy agents, financial woes, and a hostile community. The aged leader is convinced a medieval prophecy will soon come true. He says the sacred labyrinth on the grounds will soon reveal a lost relic of the early church that will reawaken faith in Europe. The other choristers are looking for excuses to start over at other chantries as they try to delay the police's attempts to search the old vaults beneath the cathedral. Can the old priest inspire the players to defend the besieged cathedral until the blessed event? Or is faith no match for agents, fines, and negative rumors? Your players will have to be the ones to decide that. So those were my adventure ideas. And is there a quote to close this out for us, Terry?
Yeah, this was just a lot of good writing. Some of the books have pithy quotes, some of them have sexy quotes, some of them have just turns of phrase that kind of make you squint. But one that very much I found touching was on page 29, where Jeremiah is talking to Rabbi Deborah, and she keeps calling him kiddo, which I kind of liked, and gives you 2 lessons. And these are: first lesson, Jeremiah, the one never asks, the one only calls. Second, when the one calls you, your options never include walking away. And I like that. So what are we reading next?
Next up is Guide to the Traditions, 281 pages telling us about the Traditions, a group that we have a few books on already in Revised Edition. So I'll be interested to see what this brings to the table. In the entirety of Revised Edition, we have 900 pages on the 9 traditions within the council, and we also have expanded sections in the core book on the traditions. So 281 pages just about the Council of 9. I'd like to see what they're going to offer us.
And for listeners, if that page count sounds big, that's because it is. This is a book that is 30,000 words shorter than the revised core rulebook and 40,000 words longer than Guide to the Technocracy. So yeah, that's what's technically known as a chunker, I think, in the industry. So that's
the technical term.
Technical term. And with that, you want to take us out?
Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. If you can follow us, you please do on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there, see the complete show notes that we prepare for you. This episode is thanks to executive producer John Magnuson, Ira Grace, Richard Bat Brewster, Michael Parker, Christopher Phillips, Ilara J. Sunsern, Bryce Perry, William Martin, William Connolly, Brendan Morrill, Andrew Kotz, Jenna F., Andrew Edelstein, Chris Sack, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep bringing you episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go change your reality. Bye.